Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Maynard, for your gracious introduction. It's good to see old friends again. And also thank all of you new friends for risking your evening and leaving the World Series at home and coming to this talk. I should say that for many years, I taught science and religion at Georgetown starting in 1970. And ever since that time, my main question has been whether science leaves any room for faith. I felt that my own Christian faith was challenged by science. And so I invented a course a long time ago for Georgetown undergraduates. And I taught it, I think, almost every semester until I retired in 2005. So much of this material has been tested on the youth of our country, and somehow some of it at least has survived. So that's one question: does science leave any room for faith? But also, a related question: do scientific discoveries leave room for hope, especially evolution and Big Bang cosmology? And those questions lead into a larger one, which I think is the central issue in science and religion today. And that's the question, what's really going on in the universe? This is not a question that our ancestors would have asked because they did not know, as we've learned in the 20th century, that the universe itself is not just a state, it's a story. It's a story of becoming, it's therefore unfinished in whatever project it has in mind. And to turn to somebody in authority, since I knew very little about how to answer this question, I started reading someone whom I had read earlier, but not very voraciously, and that was the Jesuit paleontologist, Teilhard de Chardin. Just a little bit about him for those of you who are not familiar. As I said, he was a Catholic priest, a Jesuit priest, geologist, and paleontologist. And when he was still a young priest, he started writing essays on how he would like to integrate the evolutionary sciences, such as geology, biology, and cosmology, with his own faith. And he experimented by passing around mimeographed versions of his early experiments in this attempt to rethink his faith in a scientific age. Some of his superiors got a hold of these mimeograph papers and thought that it would be better to get Teilhard out of the European theater where he was already starting to stir up too much controversy. And they persuaded him to go to China and study rocks and fossils there. And so that's where he went and spent 25 years there almost. And while he was there, he became one of the top geologists of the Asian continent, developing a sterling scientific reputation among his colleagues. And there was never anything controversial about his scientific papers. He knew the difference between religious thought about science and science itself. And he never brought anything of theology into his scientific papers. After the war, he came back to France, but he couldn't find a stable position there. So he ended up at the museum, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And that's where he stayed pretty much until his death in 1955, only days from the death of Albert Einstein, who was in Princeton at the time. They never got together. I have another talk on a possible conversation between Teilhard and Einstein, what they would have said to one another, to each other, if they had had the opportunity to get together. But after his death, the books that he had been writing on religious interpretation of science throughout his life in China and elsewhere were posthumously published. They got permission. The superiors and the Vatican had prevented these publication in his own lifetime. So it was only after his death that people started reading him avidly. And he ended up having a great deal of influence on some of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. And Harper and Row said that his book, The Phenomenon of Man, was the #1 scientific religious bestseller for them in the 20th century. He thought, unlike most other scientists, having been acquainted with Darwin and geology, and then in the early 20th century, eventually with Einstein and some of his disciples, he thought that the most important scientific discovery of modern thought was the discovery that the universe is still coming into being. He said that changes everything, and that he wanted his religious community, his fellow Jesuits, to get into their mind and into their heart the fact that we don't live in the same universe in which our ancestors nourished the Jewish, Islamic, and Christian faiths. It's a completely different setting for religious thought, the idea of a universe that's still coming into being. Well, back to my first question, I'll come back to Teilhard in a moment. Does science leave any room for faith? One answer to that question is called scientism. It's the belief that science is the only reliable guide to truth, and that therefore there is no future for faith. This was put forth especially by the so-called new atheists, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. And their thinking was that scientism is a belief that science is the only reliable guide to truth, and that's enough. There's no future for faith. And so they saw the relationship between science and faith along these lines. Science is based on evidence, they said. Faith is always belief without evidence. Science is objective and therefore capable of truth. Faith is subjective and therefore very capable of error and mistakes and wishful thinking. Science, therefore, is rational, and faith, all faith, is irrational since it's not based on evidence. People don't like to be accused of being advocates of scientism, and they think it's a smear word, but Richard Dawkins does not. He says it may be that humanity will never reach complete understanding, but if we do, I venture the confident prediction that it will be science, not religion, that brings us there. And if that sounds like scientism, so much the better for scientism. I think he's right about that. There are a lot of people, maybe half or more of the scientists in our country, and more than half of the philosophers are devotees of scientism and its offshoot, which I call scientific naturalism. Scientific naturalism is the belief that science is the only road to truth, and the only thing that science can deal with is nature. So nature is all there really is. There's no evidence for anything else. So let's focus only on the natural world. So what I had to do in my classes and in my books is ask the question, is scientism reasonable? If it's not reasonable, you don't have any obligation to hold to it. And I concluded that it's certainly not reasonable. Scientism is actually logically self-refuting. In fact, scientism says take nothing on faith, but yet it takes a firm faith to accept scientism. There are no scientific experiments that you could set up to prove that there's evidence for scientism. So it's a belief. And there's nothing wrong with having belief. As we'll see, we can't help having beliefs. Furthermore, what is the evidence that science is the only reliable way to truth? And after all, aren't there other ways of knowing, like interpersonal knowing, where science would be completely out of place? Interpersonal knowing asks us to not look at people as objects, but as subjects. And so how can you get in touch with the subjectivity of another person without using something other than scientific method? And there's aesthetic knowing, the kind of knowing that puts us in touch with the reality of beauty. To get in touch with that, you can't be objectively science. The more science analyzes beauty, the more that you lose sense of the beautiful. To get in touch with beauty, you have to allow yourself to be carried away by it somehow. Not quite a scientific way of knowing. So if there's such a thing as religious knowing, or the kind of knowing we associate with religious faith, then it would be analogous to interpersonal knowledge and aesthetic knowing, especially if you think of God as personal. Scientific evidence would not really get you in touch with that reality. furthermore, and this is the most important thing I wanted to say, is that scientists, even to do science, have to have faith and trust. There's no science without faith. The scientists, just to look at how science works, scientists look into a restricted range of empirical data in life or in nature and leave everything else out except what they're focusing on. So it's restricted data. And then they look at this data very carefully in search of intelligibility. And they frame this intelligibility in the form of hypotheses and theories. But since not every bright idea or bright hypothesis or bright theory is a true idea or a true hypothesis or theory, scientists implicitly have to make a distinction between their commitment to understanding and their commitment to truth. Not every understanding is true to the data. So in science, the hard work is to test your hypothesis, to test your theory over and over again, and to be open to revision, which requires something other than objectivity. It requires virtue. It requires the virtue of humility and courage and the ability to have compassion for people so you don't mislead them. So where then do we put faith? Faith that the universe is intelligible. There's faith by every scientist that truth is worth seeking. The scientist has to believe in the rightness of honesty. And the scientist also has to trust in his or her own mind. And if you deny that, it's because you're trusting your mind to deny that. So we can't help but trusting when we know anything. So where then do we locate theology in relation to scientific understanding? Not here, not in the area of hypotheses and theories. I believe that almost every pseudo question in science and religion stems from either religious people or scientists placing ideas or claims about God or religious claims in the same territory with scientific hypotheses. A good example of this is Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, where he has a chapter called The God Hypothesis. And what he wants to do is to trick the reader into looking upon claims about God as claims that can be verified and tested in the same way that scientific ideas are. And since they can't be verified and tested in that arena, the new atheists, all four of them to a man, conclude that since there's no scientific evidence for divine reality or for transcendent reality, religion should be rejected as fiction, as falsehood. So you don't want to put religion and theology there because religion and theology provide no scientific information. Where is theology's place then? One place to think of it is to see theology's place as a response to more fundamental questions that scientists and science itself do not ask, but still need to be asked. For example, why is the universe intelligible? I'm not saying that theology is the only way to answer that question, but if you want to put theology in a place where it won't conflict with science, it's in response to that question that arises because the scientist too has to trust that the universe is intelligible. Belief that truth is worth seeking gives rise to the question, why is truth worth seeking? What is there about truth that's so compelling? Why is honesty in doing science unconditionally right? Science cannot answer that question, but every good scientist believes that this is true. And then why should we trust our minds, especially if they are so given to deception and illusion? What is the basis for our trust in minds? So theology, to differentiate it from scientific understanding, looks for a worldview or a vision, which is what Teilhard does. Teilhard looks for a vision that can justify the scientist's faith commitments. And in that way, religion and theology can be supportive of the whole scientific enterprise by justifying the trust that's required to do science in the first place. In addition to scientific method, however, there are scientific discoveries. And William James would probably say that ever since science began in the 17th century, even though it's been a feast for the mind, it's caused souls to sag quite often. There's been a skull grinning in the banquet throughout the last 4 centuries. And I came across an article in the New York Times about a year and a half ago by the New York Times science writer, Dennis Overby, a very good writer and one whose columns and books I have found very helpful. But he wrote this in this very austere column: somewhere in the universe, in the cosmic future, there will be a final thought. When I heard that statement, he says, from a well-known astronomer at Bard College, it broke my heart. It was the saddest, loneliest idea I had ever contemplated. I thought I was aware and knowledgeable about our shared cosmic predicament. I thought I had made some kind of intellectual peace with that. But this was an angle, he says, that I hadn't thought of before. At some point in the future, there will be somewhere in the universe where there will be a last sentient being, a last conscious being, and a last thought. How does he know? He knows because of physics. The laws of thermodynamics require this conclusion. Because thinking takes energy, the energy that allows the complexity of nervous systems and brains to develop. Because it takes that energy, eventually there will not be enough energy in the universe to hold a thought. This might not take place immediately or in the near future, but even if it takes place trillions of years from now, the universe will have a last thought, and that will be sad. In the end, there will only be subatomic particles, dancing intergalactic distances away from each other in a dark silence, trillions upon trillions of years after there was any light or life in the universe. And it's because of the second law of thermodynamics, which maintains that the amount of energy available to do the work of bringing about complexity in life and in human beings and in technology, that energy is constantly on the decrease. And the measure of the amount of energy that's no longer available to bring about complexity is called entropy, E-N-T-R-O-P-Y. Entropy is constantly on the increase. That is the pile of stuff not yet never available to bring about any more complexity or to do any work. And eventually, the complexity that holds thought in existence will also be unsustainable, and the energy will no longer be available to bring about any more thoughts. So thought will come to an end. And so even what we and Overby value most, consciousness or thought, is doomed. This is the skull grinning in at the banquet. Overby is not the first to experience sadness about the death of nature. We find it in especially 19th century British poetry, including that of Matthew Arnold in his famous and lovely poem, Dover Beach, where he talks about how the tide going out is bringing the eternal note of sadness in. And he explains what he means by that. The sea of faith in which he had been nourished, the traditional cosmology, the great chain of being of the Bible, the Plato and Aristotle especially, is going to retreat. It was once, the sea of faith was once at the full, and the round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now, he says, I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. This is an age of emerging scientific materialism, where the thought was that ultimately mindless and lifeless matter is all that is really real. And this is what he's talking about when he talks about the vast edges drear, the lifelessness of the universe and of the earth, and how faith cannot survive that kind of scientific philosophy, scientific materialism, it's called. As I was reading Overby's article, I could not help recall a couple passages from Teilhard de Chardin. Promise the earth, he says in one of his essays, 100 million more years of continued growth. If he were here today, with the benefit of cosmology, since he was a young man, he would say, promise the universe 100 trillion more years of continued growth. If at the end of that period, it is evident that the whole of consciousness, the whole of thought, must revert to zero, without its secret essence being garnered somewhere or anywhere at all, then I insist we shall lay down our arms. If we really believe that, then we should have no incentive to do anything creative or productive whatsoever. Not everybody agrees with this, of course, but Teilhard is trying to think out logically what the death of thought and the death of life and the death of consciousness would amount to, what it would mean. He says the prospect of a total death will, I warn you, when it has become part of our consciousness, immediately dry up in us the springs from which our efforts are drawn. His thought goes something like this. He's looking for a way in which people can sustain all over the planet human effort, moral action, good work, scientific research and discovery, and productive education. How can we sustain this indefinitely into the future? His belief is that only if we have a zest for living, as he calls it, which means a sense that we're working for a purpose that might not be in sight, but yet somehow drives us, something that's up ahead, but somehow drives us and motivates us and joyfully to do our work and our research and discovery now. But for that to take place, in principle, there has to be room in the universe for more and fuller being. If everything just remains the same, or if everything is just a reshuffling of atoms over the course of time, that's not going to sustain our motivation. We need to have a sense that there's room for more and fuller being. And he says at one point in his writings, we have to have a sense that something immense is taking shape up ahead if we're really going to commit ourselves with all of our energy to human effort, to moral action, to work, to science, and so forth. As I was reading this, I was thinking of how when Jesus came into his public ministry, he did not hand out a list of do's and don'ts. His first words to people were, in effect, something really big is coming. He called it the kingdom. And we need now, Teilhard would say, in the age of science, to translate what that immensity would mean in terms that make sense to us now and in the 20th century. This should be the work of theology. Theology should be looking for reasons to hope and for reasons to have zest for living so that we have an incentive to contribute something in our lives, or to contribute our lives to something greater than ourselves. But in order to have that room for more and fuller being, the universe cannot be finished. The universe has to be unfinished, still coming into being, or as he would also say at times, still awakening. Already the universe has awakened marvelously to life, and more recently to thought, So why shouldn't we expect even wider awakening in the future? And this is where he's going to locate the importance of faith. Faith is not belief without evidence, as the new atheists say. Faith is a passion that looks for some indestructible goal that is a necessary postulate of effective action. Just as Immanuel Kant, to give a kind of parallel here, would say that feeling the sense of duty in yourself doesn't make sense unless there's some transcendent standard of right and wrong. And this is how Kant comes to accept and embrace the existence of God. In a parallel sort of way, Teilhard would say, look at your energy and the passion with which you pursue your work. And he's saying it doesn't make sense unless there's some indestructible goal that makes this worthwhile, not just temporarily, but forever. And he calls this something up ahead. He calls it Omega, the last letter in the Greek alphabet. He agrees with Revelation that, yes, God is both Alpha and Omega, but for Teilhard, God is more Omega than Alpha. And this is really the revolutionary aspect of his thought in terms of Christian theological thinking and reflection in the 20th century. Sometimes he calls it God Omega, and sometimes Christ Omega. Omega present in our midst, inviting us to look towards something indestructible up ahead. In other words, faith that leads to hope. And Teilhard, I think, and here I'm interpreting him in ways that he might not agree with, but I think he's saying, and this is his expression, that classical theology, the way in which he was brought up in terms of that sea of faith that Matthew Arnold regrets the passing of, that sea of faith itself might have cultivated quietly a kind of hopelessness. What does he mean by that? He means that the theme of timeless perfection, which characterized ultimate reality in all pre-scientific theology, and not just in the West, but probably to some extent all over the planet. This theme of timeless perfection, which is very attractive, at the same time, we have to be careful that it doesn't put a lid on human effort. And this is how he experienced his own Catholic spirituality when he was in the seminary. And it came to a critical point when at one time he went to his spiritual director and said, I have this passion for geology and science, but I also have read Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, who tells me to detach myself from time and to look for perfection elsewhere. And I'm attracted to that too. So which one should I pick? He eventually called this the problem of the two faiths, whether to believe in God or timeless perfection on the one hand, or whether to believe that the earth itself, and especially because of the rise of science, is opening up new horizon of the future that he found himself excited about and passionately attracted to. So which way do you go? Timeless perfection is the ideal of perfection in traditional religious piety. And it has given people the impulse to escape the world of time into the world of timelessness. And a correlate of the ideal of timeless perfection is that creation was finished completely in the beginning. Wouldn't a timeless perfection, if it were going to create a universe, create it once and for all, immediately, completely, and perfectly? The problem with that, as not only Nietzsche, but a number of 19th century atheists also pointed out, especially Friedrich Nietzsche, that it leaves no room for more being. no room for the innocence of becoming, no room for a sense that our labors make a difference. How can they if everything perfect has already been finished from the beginning? What's the point of human effort if it doesn't bring about something new, something unprecedented? If it's just spinning the wheels in the house of being, which allegedly has been built completely in the beginning. And he asked this question in many ways, doesn't theology somehow subtly suppress the zest for living, or at least some forms of theology? And this is why he got so excited about science, and especially the evolutionary sciences of geology and biology and cosmology, because they implied that something new and more has been coming into the universe from the beginning. Long before humans came along, the universe was itself an awakening. And why is it not still awakening? And why do we not understand our own identity and our own lives and their purpose in terms of contributing to that ongoing awakening, which has been going on for billions of years, as we'll see? So the sense that this world has a future inspired him to go to his spiritual director and ask him, what should he do? And his spiritual director immediately says, study geology, study the evolutionary sciences. And Teilhard credits this simple spiritual director with giving him a direction that shaped him for the rest of his life. That means that we should learn to embrace the unfinished character of our universe. So to sustain effort, life, and action, the universe must have an open future and an indestructible future, an open and indestructible future. This is what he was looking for, whereas the theology that he was learning from scholasticism was pretty much content with looking for timeless perfection and getting out of time in order to experience happiness. Teilhard experienced so much joy in doing science that something in him says, there has to be some meaning to this. So it's a postulate. Omega is not something you can prove any more than Kant could prove the existence of God by looking at the fact of duty. But what Teilhard is saying is, you can't really make sense of your own vital feelings of joy in doing research and learning unless you posit the reality of Omega. Omega is necessary to sustain the zest for living indefinitely. And so that's what he means by Omega. Again, he doesn't prove it, he postulates it. But philosophy's been getting away with that for a long time, so why shouldn't Teilhard? But what Teilhard adds to classical theism, I think, these are not his words, the sense that in some sense, Omega is not yet. Even Omega has not yet rounded itself off and perfected itself. That would lead to a reality that's stillborn, that has death rather than life intrinsic to it. So this is the way in which his thinking went. And it leads to me to ask, well, why wouldn't it be just as good to devote yourself to scientific naturalism the way the new atheists do? Haven't they put their finger on the problem when they say, let's just get rid of this timeless perfection, of this belief in timeless perfection, and then that would allow you to restrain or curb this impulse of traditional religion to have you escape from the world of time. Doesn't that sound more logical? Just get rid of the idea of God. And that would that would drain Arnold's sea of faith, which was once two at the full. It would become now empty. And once you do that, you have no need for a creator in the beginning. You have the idea or the belief that it's enough to say the world just is, as Carl Sagan does, for example, in his book Cosmos, and as many another scientist has done since then. This would mean that there are no limits on human creativity. Wouldn't that be nice? Why not accept scientific naturalism, that nature is all there is? Would that be a good way to free our creativity and give us a sense of joy in our lives? Well, look at what Dennis Overby has written. No, because nothing is indestructible. There is no room for Omega. There's no room, therefore, for the incentive that Teilhard is looking for in order to sustain good work and moral thought and moral existence indefinitely. So we're back in scientific naturalism to Overby's cosmic pessimism, which leads then to the question that I've been working on in all my career at Georgetown and elsewhere. Does current cosmology leave any room for hope? I think theology today has to be a search or quest for reasons to hope more than anything else, especially given the prominence of scientific naturalism in shaping the intellectual world, the journalistic world, and the academic world of contemporary Western culture. Does cosmology leave any room for hope? Hope for Teilhard meaning in something indestructible. We now have a consensus of scientists and cosmologists that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, the Big Bang universe. The Big Bang happened on page 1 of volume 1, and the first 2 shelves and part of the third consists of what we now know to be essentially lifeless and mindless material stuff and processes. The universe was not in a hurry to give rise to life. Neither was the Earth. The Earth spins out around the sun with other planets about 4.5 billion years ago, in volume 21. But we have to wait until somewhere in volume 22 for the first embers of life to start glowing. And these embers don't billow into anything complex until you get almost to the end of volume 29 with the Cambrian explosion 570 million years ago. And even so, dinosaurs don't come in until after the middle of volume 30. They go extinct on page 386 due to the asteroid impact on the Yucatan Peninsula. And that leaves only the last 64 pages of volume 30 for the development of mammalian life, primate life, and eventually humans. When do we humans come in? With our capacity to thought. And by thought, I mean capacity to experience, to understand, to know and decide, which shapes scientific method as well as common sense understanding as well. That doesn't come into the universe until the bottom of page 450 of volume 30. So when scientific naturalists look at this picture of the universe, they can't help but think, well, if the universe was supposed to bring about thought, why did it take so long to produce so little? That's how Bertrand Russell commented on this new cosmology. It seems that the universe has only grudgingly given rise to life 3.8 billion years ago, and even more grudgingly giving rise to thought, the phenomenon or the epoch of thought, in the last part of the last page of volume 30. This is why Overby thinks that thought is just a flash in the cosmic pan. Thought, or the whole epoch of thought, so far at least, has been confined to the last 5th or last 10th of the last page of volume 30. It's sandwiched between 13.8 mindless billion years so far, and then eventually trillions of other lifeless and mindless years going off into the indefinite future. So this sort of guarantees to the scientific naturalist the eventual death of thought. Overby pins this down to the role of entropy. It's the increase in entropy, the increase in the amount of energy no longer available to sustain life and consciousness, that accounts for the eventual death of thought. And Overby is not alone. Most scientists and almost all philosophers accept this as the cosmological framework of their thinking. However, and here I'm relying partly on Teilhard, but partly on others who have pointed out that yes, entropy seems like all bad news, but it's entropy that allows the universe to be a story. And the thing about a story is that it can carry a meaning. Most scientists do not see this narrative vein of nature. They're so intent upon finding something that's quantifiable. Einstein is a good example. Einstein found a geometric coherence, and that was beautiful enough for him, and it sustained him, not just intellectually, but religiously as well, to know that there's this eternal perfection approachable only by geometry. It's impersonal, but that's okay because it's reliable. It's not because scientific laws are enough to give us something to rely on in our lives. No need for despair, and no need for cosmic pessimism. But what Teilhard would agree is that what theology and what human beings in general are looking for to give meaning to their lives is not geometry, but narrative coherence. That's my own expression for what I think Teilhard was after. And I think what he was assuming is that somehow the narrative quality of nature can be detached from the geometry in a sense. The geometry can function like the grammar, and the narrative as the story that needs the grammar to keep it consistent and from going backwards. But what entropy does is teach us that the movement of time from past through present to future is irreversible. Not every physicist believes that. Einstein did not believe it. Einstein thought that our sense of time is just a psychological impression. And there are many, many physicists today who believe the same thing. Teilhard did not. Teilhard's a distinctive point of view, and he's not alone in thinking this, but he insisted on it, is that time is irreversible. Nothing makes sense if it's not irreversible. There are no stories. When you listen to a story, you automatically anticipate where it's going. And it's that sense of anticipation that keeps you awake and keeps you alive and keeps you working, keeps you looking for more. And so it's entropy that allows for the universe, the whole universe, to be a drama of awakening. And that raises the really good theological question that differentiates Teilhard's thought from that of other religious thinkers. Teilhard is asking us to think about awakening to what? What is the universe awakening to? We can ask that question because we are part of the universe. The universe has given rise to thought, and thought is an anticipatory reality. It anticipates understanding, truth, goodness, and beauty. So here's Teilhard's cosmology, which he thinks is perfectly consistent with Einstein and Lemaitre's cosmology. He would allow that classical theology in which he was educated would answer the question of awakening by saying that each soul is being awakened by timeless being, unity, or meaning, timeless truth, timeless goodness, beauty. As Plato taught centuries ago, this is what awakens us. The fact that these timeless transcendentals, as philosophers call them, transcendentals, being, unity, truth, goodness, and beauty, have gotten themselves quietly into our own souls and have caused our souls to search for something more, for something perfect. And that meant in traditional religion to detach ourselves from the universe, from nature, so as to come into climactic communion with these transcendentals. What Teilhard does is answer this question, awakening to what? By saying it's awakening to Omega. Now, Omega has all these attributes, but Omega adds to them the dimension of the future, of futurity. The transcendentals, as Teilhard learned in his philosophy, were static and already rounded off. Teilhard wants to think of Omega, that is God, as not necessarily fully rounded off in the same way that classical theism thought of God as eternal perfection. So his picture of the universe awakening to Omega is something like this. Anticipation is planted in the cosmos from the very beginning. And I think physics today would, at least many astrophysicists would agree with that in a way. I hope I have time to explain what I mean there. But anyway, even at the phase or epoch of mindless matter, lifeless matter, anticipation was still quietly working itself into the fabric of the cosmos. And when matter eventually awoke to life, it doesn't matter how long it took, because this is a drama of awakening. And the fact that it involves deep time makes the universe even more dramatic, more narratively valuable than it would be if it were an instantaneous creation. When life comes about, matter suddenly differentiates itself from purely chemical and physical processes. Every organism, in order to be alive, to be different from mindless matter or lifeless matter, has the characteristic of striving. This is a point made by the philosopher Michael Polanyi, who was also a devotee of Teilhard. And Teilhard, I'm sure, would agree with this. So life in straining or striving for success of some sort is anticipating in a much more intense way than the universe ever did before life came along. So whether it's an amoeba looking for a food supply, or a predator trying to catch its prey, or a prey striving to avoid the predator, or perhaps moving ahead in evolution, a college sophomore sitting in the library reading books in anticipation of finding some sort of meaning for his or her life. So all of life, including human life, is characterized by this striving. But striving does not always meet success. So there's a tragic aspect that comes into the universe, a dark aspect. With the coming of life, the possibility of failure also is there along with success. So it's a dramatic universe, which most cosmologists don't look at this dramatic aspect of the cosmos. They look at the geometry or the grammar underlying it, but they fail to look at the drama. And then life becomes sentient and eventually conscious, and eventually it becomes what Overby and Teilhard are calling thought on the last page of the last volume. And thought is the most anticipatory thing the universe had concocted until that time, because what thought is looking for is, and every scientist illustrates this, is searching for intelligibility, searching for truth, searching for rightness and responsibility. and as Einstein would illustrate, also searching for beauty. But this is not part of science. This is the necessary conditions for keeping science alive and for giving science a future. And then thought can be understood not as an alien visitor or as a temporary scum on life or as something that just popped into existence spontaneously. Thought is the cosmos in the phase of awakening more explicitly than ever, more intensely than ever to Omega. So the universe was never without thought. Thought was present embryonically from the very first moment of the Big Bang universe. So the idea that you could ever separate thought from the cosmos is an abomination to Teilhard. This is where he differed from a lot of his fellow scientists, and this is why a lot of his fellow scientists rejected him. He wanted to make consciousness or mind or thought intrinsic to the reality of nature. And he was scoffed at times for doing this. Recently, some of you might know that there's a philosopher named Thomas Nagel who wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. And Nagel had been a scientific materialist for most of his life. But he wrote this book. He's never read Teilhard, but it's almost right out of Teilhard that you can't separate mind or thought from nature. It's unnatural to do that. But yet most scientists still believe that nature is fundamentally mindless and lifeless and thoughtless, and that therefore thought, life, and faith are purely arbitrary inventions of the human mind trying to escape time, and therefore thought doesn't really exist. So this is what we've come to in much of our philosophy. And then there's faith, which is my topic for tonight, future of faith. Teilhard gives us a cosmological understanding of everything, including faith. So faith is not simply something that you can approach psychologically or spiritually even. You have to look at faith like every other phase of awakening in cosmic history as something cosmic and not just psychological. And this is why faith is important for Teilhard, not just for us and for our happiness. Faith is necessary for the ongoing becoming of the cosmos. He said in one place in his writings that what the universe needs, not what we humans need, but what the universe needs is faith, and ever more faith. Why? Because the universe is an awakening, and it should be open to further and further intensification of awakening. So in faith, the universe is searching for a dimension of more being, of room to develop that is not yet seen, but which we have to posit or postulate in order to sustain our trust that our efforts are worthwhile. And hope, which is not completely separable from faith, of course, in hope, the universe explicitly opens itself to the arrival of the future. And Teilhard, as I said earlier, asks us, and this is what differentiates him for both scientists and other theologians, is that the universe has a dimension of futurity to it. Einstein avoided this. Einstein thought that time is only another geometrical dimension of the cosmos, whereas Teilhard follows other thinkers, especially Henri Bergson, who thought similarly before Teilhard. Teilhard read Bergson's Creative Evolution when he was in the seminary, and Bergson had a great deal of influence on Teilhard. But we have to think of the cosmos as awakening to a new future. And the name of that new future is Omega. Later on in Catholic theology, the Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, in his later years, began to refer to God as the absolute future. So, and it's this future rather than something perfected. It's this ongoing futurity of a God who is still becoming more, that grasps us and takes us into itself. So the answer to the question of what is this secret, universal secret that rescues thought and effort, it's the story itself. The story itself, which is deposited moment by moment in the life of God, that allows for us to believe that there is something indestructible about our efforts. Just to close here so that this doesn't sound too unscientific, over the last 30 years or so, since I started teaching at Georgetown, the field of astrophysics has developed enormously. And nowadays, it's not unusual to find an astrophysicist suggesting that something like anticipation has been awakening in the universe since the beginning. Freeman Dyson, very well-known Nobel Prize-winning physicist, famously said that in some sense, the universe knew that we were coming. What does he mean by that? If you ask the question, what makes mind possible? What makes thought possible? Science tells us you have to have brains of sufficient complexity to make the leap into thought possible. But to have that complexity, you need a long process of evolution, which gradually complexifies matter into organic and cellular form until eventually it becomes possible for life to come about. But you can't have life, you can't take that for granted either, because to have life, you need a planet with the right chemical composition to host the phenomenon of life. And that means especially carbon, which has a talent for bonding with other atoms and thus making possible organic chemistry and that organic stuff that enters into cells and into life in general. But you can't take carbon, you can't take these planets that have carbon implanted in them for granted either, because in order to get carbon, you have to go all the way back in astronomy and astronomical history to the massive stars that accumulated after the Big Bang, that got so hot at their core that they transformed the fuel, the original hydrogen and helium, which had been there since the beginning, transformed that into larger or heavier chemical elements, especially carbon, but others also that are necessary for life. But in order to have that primordial fuel of hydrogen and helium that comes into massive stars, which gets so hot because of gravity at their centers that they explode in supernovas and distribute these chemicals throughout the cosmos, you have to have this something special in the chemistry and the physics of the first moment of the Big Bang universe that makes hydrogen, free hydrogen, and helium possible. And to understand what happened in that first moment, the moment of creation, some scientists call it, you have to have a universe which has fixed from the beginning an exact expansion rate to balance the gravitational coupling constant that pulls matter together. They have to be in balance. They have to be precise to an infinitesimal degree, mathematically speaking. And there's no reason why they couldn't have been brought about by other kinds of values mathematically. But the mathematical values and the expansion rate and gravitational force had to be just right if this whole sequence of events is going to end up producing thought. This is an anticipatory universe. And other factors like the ratio of electron to proton mass has to be just right, 1 over 1856 or whatever it is, rather than over 1857. The ratio has to be fixed precisely. If there's going to be free hydrogen, the fuel for the stars that create carbon, which is necessary for life and for brains and for mind. And the ratio of the weak to the strong nuclear forces, and several other factors. Martin Rees has written a book called Just 6 Numbers about all this. They had to be in place in the beginning. And he insists that there's nothing about one of these numbers that necessarily brings the other along with it. So you have to have an improbable convergence of independent conditions and constants to make this whole story possible. This is why Freeman Dyson says, in some way, the universe knew that we were coming. So even scientists today, many of them are allowing that anticipation of a sort was front-loaded into the universe, so that what we take to be thought was never absent from this story. And to think of thought, as most philosophers still do, as something that's completely independent of matter, that is something absurd, kind of scum on matter, does not any longer correlate with the best physical science. So Teilhard had no access to this, but he had an intuition, which he expresses in many ways in his writings, that we live in a universe that thought has always belonged to nature, and that nature has always belonged and will always belong to Omega. I think that's long enough. Thank you.
Just your last point, it sounds crazy, but there are some people who would say, why do you pick only the constants as the one thing in the universe that hasn't evolved?
Yeah.
And say they could very well have evolved as well to move against each other, just as in our atmosphere and so forth, things are beautifully balanced, but they didn't have to be. What they did was adjust against each other.
Yes.
So the constants may not have been so constant.
Well, and the constants, as many scientists now speculate, could have evolved themselves over a massive amount of time. But even so, they have a kind of relative stability to them that I think allows them to function as constant, as grammatical constants. When I write a story, for example, the story itself is unpredictable. And even I don't know where it's going to go. But I do know that if it's going to make sense to anybody, it has to adhere to grammatical rules. And so I use the analogy, it's a metaphor of grammar, and grammars can evolve over long periods of time as well to contextualize the contingency. There's a contingent aspect to the universe. If the universe were totally predictable, there would be no novelty, nothing. Evolution would be simply a matter of reshuffling Democritus atoms in a whole sequence of random and unintelligible changes, which is okay. I mean, for a lot of scientists, that's enough for them. But for Teilhard, and this is true of myself too, there has to be some sort of consistency that keeps the story from collapsing back into chaos at each moment. Anticipation is not just wishful thinking. It's a kind of causal factor that modern science has not used, but which an increasing number of scientists are talking about, that we live in an anticipatory universe, that somehow the future, in ways that we can't imagine, is always a factor in what's going on in the universe. And that's what Teilhard was hinting at in his metaphor of omega, I think.
Okay.
Thank
We
you.
got one here.
Dr. Haught, I like to strive and believe that I'm going somewhere, have purpose,
Mhm.
but I don't think my desire prevents nothingness, obliteration from being the final word.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes,
Zoom can hear.
That it's still possible for people, for rational people to believe that they are going down the pit of nothingness. Why isn't that a rational alternative? To respond to that question, I would have to call upon another Jesuit philosopher, Bernard Lonergan. And what he would say to you is just reflect on what brought that question to me about in your own life. It was your assumption, your belief that your mind has the integrity to distinguish between the nonsense I gave you tonight and truth. And that's exactly what I mentioned earlier, that there are things about thought that we don't usually think about. And one of them is trust. You trust that you can make a distinction between bright ideas and true ideas. So how are we going to make sense of that trust? That's what I'm asking about. And I can't give you a philosophical or a theologically watertight response, but I can say, I think that it's not irrational on your part to trust that your mind is capable of awakening to truth, to goodness, to beauty. And what gives your mind its indestructibility is not your biology, not evolutionary history, but that future toward which you have been leaning, that the whole universe has been anticipating, of being, truth, goodness, unity, with a dimension of futurity to it, if you take Teilhard's notion of omega into account. So you have to ask your question then, can I make sense of my taking the pains to ask that question you just did, if the universe at bottom is just pointless? That's not a proof, but it's a postulate.
Question here.
First, I always wanted
Or-
thank you for just this presentation that is so incredible and easy to follow because of your really amazing slides. And it's just, my question is on the slide that it had all those ovals, where you have life and then thought and then faith and omega. I'm wondering where love is in all this.
Very good. I'm glad you asked that. That's a very good question. And if I had time to give the rest of my talk, I would point out that in order for omega to be realized, to be reached, the universe not only has to be awakened, it has to learn to love. But love also is love in the sense that you're talking about, also is anticipated by features of the cosmos from the very beginning, that no advance in the awakening of the universe has ever taken place without the entities at that particular level getting themselves together in association and eventually integration into something new. So it's another word for anticipation is emergence. So if you're going to have an emergent universe in which life develops out of matter and then mind out of life and then faith out of thought, you have to allow for a principle that's operating throughout the universe from the beginning. And that principle is in its chief exemplification It's what we call selfless love, or the self-sacrificing love of God. I didn't talk about that, but that has to be the ingredient that brings together the elements into association, into integration, and then into emergence of something new. This happens again and again in the course of cosmic history. But that attractive force that you find operating at each level and becoming more intense as you get to the human level, and more dangerous too, has been part of the anticipatory universe. Love has been anticipated from the very way in which matter has behaved by self-organization throughout the 13.8 billion years. So,
Question here.
Thank you, Dr. Haught. I was wondering how the concept of awakening and moving toward Omega in Teilhard's thought, and maybe in yours too, relates to the New Testament concept of the return of Christ and a new heavens and a new earth, and that sort of hopeful promise in the New Testament.
thank you. That's an excellent question. And I didn't cover that either. But if I were going to do more on Teilhard's thought, I would eventually have to talk about his Christology. His Christology, he plants against the backdrop of this same cosmology. He talks about cosmogenesis and Christogenesis as two ways of reading the same story. We've looked at it from the point of view of cosmogenesis, but Christogenesis is for Teilhard the fundamental, beautiful source of happiness of his life. His thinking, just briefly, is in the beginning, God wills not many separate things to go their own way, but God wills his Christ. And to will his Christ, God has to will a universe that serves to give birth to Christ. And in giving birth to Christ, in Christ's own person, the universe awakens climactically to God, and God becomes fully incarnate. The future becomes fully present to each moment. So this future that we're talking about is not something out there. It's brought to flesh in the person of Christ. And Teilhard would go on to say in the ideal church as well, the communion of saints. So communion is the ultimate thing he's looking for, but a communion that does not melt or homogenize the entities that make it up, but that differentiates them and gives them back to themselves. So that his cosmology is one that's not at all deterministic as Einstein's was and other scientists are. It's a cosmology that, because it has this narrative of dimension to it, is differentiating the entities at each level from each other more, so that when the universe arrives at the level of terrestrial bringing about human existence, it's also bringing about freedom as well. So freedom is however, is the capacity to relate. It's the capacity for intimate communion. Without that realization of freedom, freedom is empty. So, but he believes in freedom as well. So.
Two quick online questions. One is informational. The graphic of the 30 volumes, is that yours?
Yes. I started developing it when I was teaching science and religion at Georgetown, just to give the kids a sense of the scale of the cosmos. But anybody who wants to use it can use it. I give you permission.
Great. The other question is more substantive, and I'll repeat this question for the Zoom audience.
Yeah.
Say more about how your Catholicism has shaped your own thinking.
Well, I'll fall back on Teilhardian thought, because his ideas have really influenced my Catholicism. He says that even though the form of theology in a particular age is never decisive and never complete, and will eventually give way to other forms And like what's happened in my own life is that the what I call the analogical Platonic sort of great chain of being, hierarchical sea of faith, which shaped Matthew Arnold's life and the lives of probably most of you in here, eventually gave rise to what I call an anticipatory faith. The traditional Catholic approach, which is still very much alive in the churches, is a participative vision of reality. Everything on earth, everything in nature participates in perfection and reveals that perfection. And that's the essence of sacramental theology that I was trained in and that I still embrace in Catholicism. What Teilhard does, and what I've begun to do, is to look upon the things of nature, not just as analogies of perfection already realized, but as anticipations of something very alive that's still coming into being up ahead. And that somehow motivates my sense of effort and action in a way that a universe that's already rounded off in eternum cannot do. So, and I consider my thought completely Catholic, because the Bible is a Catholic book. People might not necessarily believe that, but my approach is really fundamentally Abrahamic. It's more Abrahamic than Platonic, whereas I think most Catholic theology is still more Platonic or Aristotelian or Thomistic than it is hopeful or biblical or Abrahamic. So there's plenty of room under what I call Catholicism for an anticipatory approach to transfigure the Platonic analogical approach or sacramental approach.
Thank you. Question here.
Yes, Dr. Haught, did Teilhard ever specifically address omega as an alternative to the second law of thermodynamics?
Well, he was convinced that the second law of thermodynamics is true, and maybe there will be a heat death of the universe. But meanwhile, a grand story of awakening has taken place. And since that's not something physical, it's something deeply spiritual, but it's taken time, the reality of concrete physical time to unfold. Since it's somehow distinguishable and even detachable from the heat death, it can be thought of as being taken into the life of God permanently, empathetically, and everlastingly. And this is a kind of thought that's been developed in more explicit terms in what's called process theology, which takes Alfred North Whitehead's scientific understanding as its framework. So yeah, there's nothing opposed to the second law of thermodynamics, but we have to look at what's happening in the universe, not just thermodynamically, but narratively as well. And just another side note to that, a student of Whitehead named Charles Hartshorne asked us to do this little exercise. Think about your own life story. Will that ever perish? In some way, won't it be true, trillions of years from now, that you were here in this auditorium in October 2024? That the fact that you have been part of this story and that you have a specific story will never perish. It will always be true. Then the question Hartshorne asks is, where will it be true? And this is where he thinks it's totally rational to think of the reality of God as preservative of every story, of every person, of every universe, or every multiverse. That there's a strain of permanence that we often ignore or turn away from, that's present in the narrative quality of the cosmos.
Question here.
Thank you. I hope I don't embarrass myself here. When I go after a roach to kill it, it runs like crazy. And I think, why? Because it knows that something bad is going to happen to it, and it avoids me often. And it goes
as if it knows that it has other work to do. And that it's anticipating that. And
Yeah.
for me, that's a helpful way of thinking about the whole evolving, the becoming.
Yeah. And it's a good way of thinking about what distinguishes life from non-life. In the scientific naturalist worldview, life is reducible to mindless and lifeless stuff. But in the Teilhardian view, life is, although continuous physically, life is made up of chemicals and so forth. A living organism has an anticipatory quality about it that you don't find in a rock or in a pebble or oxygen molecule, whatever. There's something about the universe that makes it become increasingly anticipatory. So if you relate that to a theology of creation, it turns us away from the idea that God created everything perfectly and immediately in the beginning, and gives to the process of evolution and life and cosmology a value, a storied quality, one of my friends calls it, a storied value that it wouldn't have if everything sprang immediately into perfect existence. So somehow the value of life, and Platonic thinkers and traditional Catholic theologians don't think in these terms either, but there's something about life that gets its value, not just from the divine immediate implantation of a soul or of a principle of life, but from the fact that it's a story of struggle, of experiment, of suffering, and so forth. It gives it a dimension of fullness, of depth that life would not have if we thought of it as simply an immediate, instantaneous, perfect creation, and should allow us to think of our own lives as having a value, a narrative value that we might not, I mean, we all, as Hans Kung puts it, one way to think about resurrection is that the story of each life is taken into the divine life. And so the story is always going to be there, and it can be transformed. Like in any story, things can be transformed as the story goes on. So it's good to think of matter as part of a narrative development rather than an immediate explosive coming into being.
Time for one more question,
Okay,
but choose your most important one.
Okay, then I'll go seek in the future then, because one of the ones looks into the Big Bang, but, so thank you so much. This is a great way to spend Friday night. So in this, using this, image here, or the other one in which you have, Big Bang and then going to mind, is there a place for artificial intelligence in anticipation of the singularity?
Yes. Very much so. Teilhard,
Repeat that question.
okay, is there a place in this way of looking at things for artificial intelligence? Just very briefly, Teilhard was one of the first people to use the term noosphere to describe what will be happening to the Earth in the next phase of the ongoing complexification of matter. So after the world has produced life and mind, it's not finished. Because of the associative quality of entities throughout the evolutionary process, individual humans can come together. And as they come together, they can invent, and they can invent technology, and they can invent ways of intercommunication. And that's so consistent with the anticipatory notion of an awakening universe. Theoretically and in principle, artificial intelligence should not scare us, but our misuse of it, our misuse of our freedom in using artificial intelligence can ruin it. But ideally, if the universe is going to keep advancing in consciousness and awakening and thought, it has to do so at a higher level than it has so far in the cranium of each one of us. And one of the things about the global geometric quality of Earth is that this kind of ongoing evolution can take place individually only so far, but when the globe will turn us back on each other. So, or at least give us the opportunity and even the obligation to interrelate with others. And social media and the laying of cables from Europe to America in Teilhard's day reminded him of the fibers of the brain that had to interconnect in order for the leap into thought to take place. So also he thinks it's not altogether impossible. It's reasonable for us to work toward an earth where we can, instead of fighting one another, communicate in such a way that something will explode from our midst, something new. And this is where he develops his Christology, is the figure of Christ would for him be the center around which this developing of evolution would take place at the human level. So it's something to inspire us. So.
Thank you, Dr. Haught. Let's show our appreciation once again.